Welcome to the walk-around tour of the new Jaguar 800 500 series model. So we'll start at the front of the machine and work our way around. So starting off, we'll start with our feed rollers. So on this side of our feed rollers, we have our kidney box. Our kidney box will then have a sight gauge for maintenance. So we can then park the feed rollers so they're level, and we can have a look here and make sure we've got enough oil in our kidney box. Below that we have another chain box. This chain box is full of semi-fluid grease. It'll need to be checked once a season just to make sure the levels are correct and everything is okay. Behind the guard here we then have our front attachment drive belt. This belt is then self-tensioning whenever the front attachment drive has been activated. Maintenance points in here, you do have your front attachment drive brake, and that will need to be adjusted every so often during your servicing procedures. Moving on up, we then have our connections for our chopping cylinder and our feed rollers. Top we have our electrical connection for our metal detector. Below we then have our two grease pipes. Now, one thing to point out with these grease pipes, if you are taking them off, you want to make sure whenever you put them back on that they are nipped up with spanners. If they're not nipped up correctly, it can stop the flow of grease and you'll then get malfunction indicators with your greasing system. Moving on around from our feed rollers, we then go to our front drive axle. So for the new 500 series machines, we have now upgraded the front drive axle. The upgrades basically mean that we now have more tractive force with our front axle. So better climbing ability, better performance and more torque for going forward. Moving on around from here, up above, we now have fitted a new 20 litre hand wash tank. This hand wash tank can be used from the opposite side of the machine. So if you are out doing any maintenance procedures on your machine, you can wash your hands before you get back in. Very important if you're using any additives, hands can be washed before you get back into the machine to eat your sandwiches. Moving on around, we then have our diesel tank fill up point here, our AdBlue tank fill up here. So yes, all machines now have moved to stage 5, so that's the latest emissions standards for our engines. So all the machines now, right from the smallest to the biggest, will now have AdBlue. So moving on from here, we'll then open our side panel. So our side panel open, it gives us access to our maintenance area. So first thing we see in our maintenance area is our diesel filter. So this is our primary diesel filter, first one out of the tank. We have our primer there for priming up if we've ever changed any fuel filters or unfortunately run out of diesel. So that's there for that. One thing I would say about the primer, if you have changed the fuel filters with the fuel system in these machines, you need to pump the primer up till it goes hard and keep on pumping. That will then completely bleed the machine before you start turning the machine over. Behind our filter, we then go into our coolant pack. Nice rotary screen, new style coupling for our vacuum arm to keep the screen nice and clear. Linchpin off, that will then gain us access to our cooling pack. So inside our cooling pack here, we have our 5 radiators. So on the back, we start at the top, we have our intercooler. Moving into the middle section, we then have our oil cooler. Down below, we have our coolant radiator, and on the opposite side, we'll have a fuel cooler and our air conditioning condenser. These radiators want to be kept nice and clean, so every so often we do want to be blowing them out, make sure the air is flowing through nicely. You will find with a rotary screen, it will keep everything nice and clean, but some routine maintenance is always good to make sure the radiators are working efficiently. Closing the radiator pack back up again. Up above the radiator pack, we have our 2 air filters. Now, the required maintenance for the air filters in the operator's manual states that the air filters should only be cleaned whenever the warning light comes on the dashboard of the machine. So we do have a pressure sensor in the intake into the engine. If it sees too much sucking force going into the engine, it will then tell you need to change your air filters. Air filters, best way of cleaning them, we can take them out, we can give them a tap on the side, get the dust off, and then everything will be good to go. We want to be careful whenever we're using air lines because high pressure air can perforate the membranes in the filters. So if you are blowing them down with air, it needs to be high volume, low pressure air. Moving further into our maintenance, up in the back we then have our auto greasing system. So our auto greasing system in this machine consists of an 8 kilo hopper. Pretty maintenance free system. The only thing the operator has to do is to fill it with grease. But the one thing you have to remember whenever filling the auto greaser is it needs to be pumped in. The reason behind that is whenever it's pumped in, everything is going through the pump. You've got no airlocks, you've got no dirt. There is a screw cap on the top, but that is only for maintenance access. I try and refrain from spooning the grease in because you'll then introduce air bubbles and dirt and you can get problems with your auto greaser. So that's all up there. As I say, fairly maintenance free system. Only other thing to point out in the maintenance area from our point of view, we have an extra coupling, the same in the front, for the auto greaser for the corn cracker. If the corn cracker is in the machine and you want to remove it, pipe loops up, make sure you nib it up with the spanners. It has to be nipped up with the spanners to make sure that it's fully connected and the grease is flowing. If it doesn't flow, you get your blockage warning and then your machine might not be getting greased. So one thing to point out. Moving back, we then come to our fan belt system. So we have upgraded the fan belt system on the machine slightly. We've got a new style tensioner on our belt. It's now a lot easier system to read. So we've got our setting gauge, we've got our arrow, and we're basically lining up the washer on the end of our spring to the end of the arrow. Nice and simple procedure. Open the panel, have a look. If it's in the right place, you're then good to go. Moving on around, we obviously have our auxiliary drive belt on our engine. All self-tensioning, fairly maintenance free. So whenever we come on around, we then come into our battery box. So this machine here is slightly different in the fact that it is a new generation machine, but it has got the old generation engine. So currently in this battery box we still have our 3 battery system, but moving forward onto the new stage 5 machines we will then reduce to 2 batteries. So currently at the minute we have 24 volt start, 12 volt operation. On the new machines in stage 5 it will then be 12 volts the whole way through, but we'll have a changeover relay for our 24 volt starting. This isn't a new system, there's not much difference, it's actually just copied off the larger MAN Jaguars in the 900 range. So we're just rolling that out through the entire system. One other change with the stage 5 machines, you'll see down here our mounting bracket. This mounting bracket will then have an LED fitted. That LED is then to warn you that you cannot turn the isolator off while the LED is lit. The reason behind that is with the new stage 5 machines, you will then have a cool down procedure for your after treatment system. So whenever you're cooling it down, the light stays on. Whenever the light goes off, you can switch off your isolator. This process can take somewhere in the region of sort of 2 to 5 minutes, but in some cases it can take up to half an hour to 45 minutes to complete the cool down procedure. Reason behind the length changes, it depends how much AdBlue you've got in the tank. The more AdBlue you have in the tank, the quicker it is because you've got a higher volume of liquid. If you've got less in the tank, it might take a little bit longer to cool the system down. So that's everything in our battery box. Moving on round towards the back of our machine, we then go into the back of our engine compartment. So in our engine compartment, main things we need to look out for, we've got our oil dipstick. Nice accessible point, back panel open, you can then pull your dipstick out, check your oil level. If you do need to top your oil level up, the filler cap is right beside. So nice easy access and easy topping up of your oil. Moving on into the middle, we've got our nice big air tank. Air tank can then be used for blowing down, cleaning down the machine. just to keep everything nice and clean whenever you're doing your maintenance procedures. So pointing out the filters in this area, we have our main oil filter in our oil filter block. Now, if we are doing any maintenance ourselves with the filter systems, it's important that this hydraulic system is filled with a pump. All the oil should be pumped in through here. The reason behind that is whenever you pump it in, you're filling the filter, you're filling the whole system, and then the last thing you're filling is the tank. So you're getting no air in the system, all the air is then forced out, and it stops any cavitation or anything within the system. So main filter is here, and then in behind we have a secondary filter as well, just to make sure your oil is kept nice and clean. So flat face coupling, pump it in there, nice low pressure, and then down below that we then have our test port. This test port can then be used for tasks such as bleeding your corn cracker hydraulics. So we can connect onto here, bleed your corn cracker hydraulics with the low pressure oil. Moving on around, we can see in here we've got our pump system. 3 big pumps, one red, one black, one silver. Red one is for our ground drive, black one is for our high pressure hydraulics, and then the silver one's for our low pressure hydraulics. Moving up from there, we then go to our hydraulic oil tank. So hydraulic oil tank, nice sight gauge. We then have our low level indicator, so if your level drops in your tank for any reason, you get a warning on your screen before the tank becomes completely empty. At the top, we have a cap. This cap is actually designed as a breather. As I said earlier, large quantities of oil should be pumped into the machine to make sure that it's filtered going in. Now, if you are topping the oil up through this cap, I would advise with caution that you make sure that the gauze is always within the top of the tank. We want no dirt in the system. I will say the gauze does make it slow to fill, but take the time, do it right. You don't want any dirt within the system to create any problems for you. So that's our lubricants from that end. We've talked about our grease. Our header tank for coolant is up above the engine. Again, silicone based coolant needs to be kept nice and full to make sure that the engine's sufficiently cooled. Moving on around the machine, we then enter into our toolbox. So in the toolbox, we obviously have our tools provided with the machine. You should have everything in here sufficient enough to do all your maintenance procedures on the machine. In here, we then have our cables and we have our air line for maintenance with our blowgun. We then have our tool for locking off the cutting cylinder if we're doing any maintenance. We have our sharpening stone adjustment tool to make adjustments to your sharpening stone. You also get your wheel brace should you ever need to change a wheel. Hopefully that won't be too often. And then finally, underneath our toolbox, we then have our setting gauge. So this setting gauge here can be used to find the parking position for our shear bar. What it can also do is measure our percentage of our blades. So we can actually see how square our cylinder is, and we can measure our blades percentages here as well, depending on the measurements. So it gives us a rough guide of how much is left on our blades. So lots of tools in there to carry out the majority of your maintenance procedures. Get everything packed back in again. So moving on around the side, we'll open up our side panel on this side. So side panel, nice access into our engine. We'll then have our main drive clutch, dry clutch, maintenance free. Smooth actuation process, so the machine, depending on temperature, how much it's run, it will always smoothly engage the drum so you haven't got any shock loads. Up here we then have our after treatment system. As I said, all the new machines, the majority of the new machines will be coming out with stage 5 emissions. There will be some of the earlier machines that might come with tier 4 final engines, but the majority will come with stage 5. Meets all the emission standards to make sure that our daisies are coming out through our exhaust. But yeah, unfortunately, our AdBlue's here. We've embraced it, proven reliable technology now in the machine, and everything's good going forward. One thing to point out, if you are doing any cleaning or you need more access to the engine, these mudguards are easily removable. 2 linch pins out, the mudguard will then slide off nice and easily. So moving forward into our machine compartment again, we then point out our additive system. So our onboard additive system is mounted here. We've got our pump and all our functions there. Up above our additive system, we then have all our hydraulics on the machine. Now, we'll not go into the hydraulics in too much depth. It is a dealer job if you do need any servicing done on the hydraulics, but one thing I will point out, you've got your high pressure valve block here. That high pressure valve block operates at 210 bar. If for any reason you are making any adjustments to the hydraulic system or you've got any problems, just be mindful you've got 210 bar in there. Low pressure hydraulics are then running at 30 bar, and then your lift lower valve block then has a mixture of 210 bar and 30 bar. So very high pressure oil in the machine. Just be careful if you are going to any hydraulic components in the machine, just remember high pressure. As I say, majority of the jobs should be carried out by the dealer with the hydraulic system. So that's everything in here. Closing down our side panel, we then have our access up into our cab. We've got one button on the side of the machine. That is then for priming your additive system. Up on top, we then get access to our screen wash fluid reservoir is up on top, and then beside that we then have our manual greasing point. So if you do need to manually grease the machine for any reason, we do have a grease nipple up there you can attach onto, and that will grease the whole machine through the auto greasing blocks if for any reason you need to. Moving on around again, we come to our external controls on our machine. So we have gained 2 new buttons. These 2 new buttons can activate external functions on certain front attachments. If we do want to activate these, we have to press 2 buttons at one time for a safety to make sure that we have both hands in the machine and we're not going to activate the function that can cause us any damage. Same for up and down, and then we can still lift our header up and down as required and reverse our feed rollers as required from this point. So that's everything in our control panel. Moving on around the front, we then come to our front connection point. We have got our airline connection point, we've got our 2 hydraulic connections for our front attachment, we've got our front light connection, 12 volt port as well, and then we have our front attachment connector. Finally in the front here we then have our yellow connection. This is our connection for our direct disc for engaging our clutches for our easy starting process. So that's all our connections for our front attachment. Moving in back to our feed rollers, we have our 2 hydraulic pipes. These connect into our reverser motor because we need a hydraulic motor to reverse the mechanical feed roller drive. Moving down here, we then have our gearbox system for our feed rollers. So we've got 2 gearboxes, we have our high and low speeds for our cutting ranges, and then we have 1st, 2nd and 3rd gear. So for example, in this machine, that gives us a chop length from 6mm up to 22mm. So any adjustments you need to make to the 800 series machines will need to be made outside with your mechanical levers. In behind here, you then have your quick stop clutches. You want to make sure that they're serviced adequately every year. If you've got any metal detections or stone detections, that's what stops our feed rollers nice and quickly. Again, with maintenance, we have our oil levels for our main gearbox. That wants to be checked daily. Make sure your oil levels are always nice and topped up. And that concludes our quick tour around our Jaguar 800 machine.